All right, so I am going to start the final details on my little fingers and toes. We're going to put the nail beds and nail tips on. I'm going to take my cream base. I'm going to take a little bit of the wet and water out of that and stick it into my lid of my jar that has previously had a little bit of the purple in it. This is going to be my moon base. I don't want it to be too purple and I don't want it to be too cream. There you go, that's a good color. Now I'm going to use one tiny paintbrush to put it on and one tiny paintbrush to smooth it out. I only put this color on the big toes and then on the fingers if they're big enough to take it. Right at the base of the finger. This paintbrush is a pain. Okay, just a second. My bristles are going in different directions and I can just see that's going to be a nightmare. Okay, so clean off your paintbrush, make sure it's nice and pointy. Get a little bit of paint on it. And then we're going to add just a little smear of that paint right at the base in kind of a half moon type of a oval. With our other little paintbrush, we're going to gently just touch that until it's blended and smooth and even in the right shape that you want it. So that's one big toe. We're going to come to another big toe and do the same thing. I don't use pure white for this or the pure cream because naturally it's kind of more of a purple color. I'm just barely touching this and it's kind of smearing it into a flatter, not gloppy looking texture. And the fingernails on this sculpt are very, very tiny. So I'm just going to do tiny little ones right at the top of the nails. Some people don't think babies have moons on everything, on all their fingers. My kids did. And I have pictures of their tiny little hands, and 4 of the 5 were premature. So if my preemies could have it, most babies could. Some babies don't, but the same thing applies to adults. Maybe it's a genetic thing, I don't know. I don't have it on all of my fingers, but I have it on my thumbs and a couple of my bigger fingernails. Just gently tap these down to sink the thicker globule looking globs of paint to make sure they're all smooth. I'm going to do the first 3 on this one and then come back with a blender sponge or brush just to capture those little ends that I see that are a little bit thicker. Smooth it down a little bit. Okay, so the moons part are done. I'm going to set my cream aside so that I can come back to that when it's time for the nail tips. I'm going to clean the excess white off my brush. I'm going to come into the purple color. And I don't want it too wet, but I don't want it too dry. And right at the bottom of where I put that white line in, I'm going to kind of give it a half circle and paint the bottom of the fingernail this maroony color. And with my tiny blending brush, I'm going to grab it right at that line and pull it straight down to make the little grooves that are often found in the nails. And that should allow a little more color to stay right at the nail tip area. You don't want it so thick that it makes it look like you're putting fingernail polish on the baby, but thick enough to add a little bit of color on the tips. This also gives it itty bitty microscopic little grooves that are naturally found in your fingernails. Or at least they're found in mine. Maybe I just have wonky fingernails, I don't know. This is a paintbrush that I have cut down to the bare nothings as well. Most of my itty bitty paintbrushes are impossible to find naturally, so you have to take the smallest you can find and then trim it to whatever size you need it from there. And this makes that white layer, even though you can almost barely see it when you put the white stuff on it, it makes it kind of pop out and actually visible when it's not next to something nearly the same color. I'm a little bit lucky that both of these hands are kind of open. Sometimes you get a hand that is closed into a fist and you have to kind of turn it upside down and backwards to try to get to the nails. Okay, now on the toes, they're a little bit different because only one of them has the moon, but they're the same because it's the same concept whether they have the moon or not. Without the moon there, we're just going to color in the whole toenail. I suppose when you're putting the other first layers of paint on the toenails, you could probably just color it in, but it's a habit for me to separate them and identify them as being separate. I don't like how these ones are actually blending in so much, so I'm actually going to come back in a second here after I get this little nail done and give it a little more red around the actual cuticle. Just to give this little nail bed some color. These little toes are looking kind of pale and peaked, so I'm going to give them a little more definition between them as well. Oh, it looks a little messy. Make sure it gets smooth. Okay, so that gives you a little more of a base for your toe so it doesn't look quite so pale. One more little footy, and then we'll come in with the nail tips themselves. This one has a nice base next to the toenail, so I don't know that I'll have to do more of the red on the cuticle line. They still look a little unfinished, but that's because the nail tips aren't quite on there yet. This one wasn't quite as dark as some of the others, so I wanted to add a little more color to it while I still had it here. All right, so these ones are good to go. Now I'm going to come and bring you one of my most wonky looking paintbrushes, but is absolutely the only one that I use for this concept. This is my nail brush, a nail tip brush. It used to be quite long and pointy, and I have trimmed it down to nearly nothing, and then I cut it off so it would have a very blunt end on it. And I did that on purpose so that I could use it as a way to have a controlled amount of paint right at the tip. So I'm going to grab a little bit of the wet at the bottom and touch the paint at the top. I think that's going to be too thick. Make sure you don't get any on your hands, or this will be a big smeary mess. All right, and then I'm going to go sideways. I'm not going to paint down or use the top of the paintbrush. I'm going to actually just drag it along the tip of the brush, going sideways in an itty bitty fashion. Just tiny. I don't want it so thick that it becomes kind of an ugly eyesore. Babies have itty bitty nails, and getting this part right will really add depth and realism to your baby. I'm going to have an interrupting in 3, 2, 1. Okay. Next foot. All right. Little tiny nail tips on little tiny toes. Now to our hands. The same concept. You just drag it right across the very tip. Tiny little nail tips. One more little hand. And you're going to try really hard not to touch these nail tips to the ground when they cook. Okay, so my next step is, at this point, baby is pretty much done. The last thing I have to do is, after it's cooked, is come back and thicken out some of these eyebrows and finish the eyebrow hairline. And I'm going to cook this baby, and then I'm going to seal the paint on the limbs. I can't seal the paint on the head until the eyebrows are done, but we'll get the limbs done next. So I'll show you that step after she's cooked. I have to put it on when it's hot, so I'm going to change the video location to put it on right next to my oven. So I'll see you in a few minutes.